The Soviet economy, as presented to the world and to its own citizens, was the world's second largest, a centrally planned industrial powerhouse that achieved full employment, guaranteed housing and healthcare, educated its population to high levels, electrified vast territories, built the world's most extensive railway network, pioneered space exploration, and maintained military parity with the United States while doing all this. And the official statistics showed consistent growth, 5-year. Plans exceeded, production targets met, Soviet GDP growing at rates that sometimes exceeded Western economies, and Western economists and intelligence agencies took these statistics seriously, debated whether Soviet growth model might be superior to capitalism, worried that the Soviet Union might eventually overtake the United States economically. But all of this was based on fundamentally false information. The Soviet economy was a Potemkin village on continental scale. The statistics were fabricated. The apparent successes were often literal facades. The growth was largely illusory. And underneath the propaganda and the statistical manipulation was an economy that was simultaneously producing enormous quantities of goods that nobody wanted and failing to produce basic goods that everyone needed. An economy where factories met production quotas by producing heavy useless goods while shortages of light useful goods persisted. Where the official economy existed alongside a massive black market that actually supplied most consumer needs. Where innovation was stifled because central planners couldn't process the information needed to coordinate a complex modern economy. Where workers pretended to work because the state pretended to pay them. Where theft and bribery and informal exchange were necessary for survival. Where the entire system was sustained by oil and gas exports that generated hard currency and by systematic looting of captive economies in Eastern Europe. And where the leadership increasingly understood that the system wasn't working but couldn't reform it without threatening their own power and the ideological foundations of the state. And this economic dysfunction, hidden behind propaganda and statistical manipulation and secrecy, was the real Soviet Union. And understanding how this system actually worked, how it failed, and how it collapsed reveals fundamental truths about the limits of central planning, about information problems in complex economies, about how authoritarian systems can sustain themselves for decades while fundamentally dysfunctional, and about how the gap between official reality and actual reality can become so large that when it finally closes, the entire system disintegrates almost overnight, leaving observers surprised even though the collapse was inevitable and the signs were everywhere for those willing to see them. The fundamental problem was the calculation problem identified by Austrian economists, particularly Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, who argued that socialist central planning couldn't work because planners lacked the information to allocate resources efficiently. In a market economy, prices emerge from millions of transactions, encoding information about relative scarcity and value. And changes in prices signal producers about what to produce and consumers about what to consume. This information processing happens automatically through markets. But in a planned economy, planners have to decide what to produce and in what quantities without price signals, have to somehow aggregate information about millions of products and billions of preferences and constantly changing conditions. And this is informationally impossible. There's no way for central planners to gather and process all this information. So planned economies inevitably misallocate resources, produce things people don't want while failing to produce things people need. And Soviet planners understood this problem intellectually, but believed they could overcome it through scientific management, through computer systems and mathematical optimization and detailed planning. But they never could. The information problem proved insurmountable, and Soviet economy was chronically plagued by imbalances, shortages of some goods and surpluses of others, queues for basics like bread and toilet paper, while warehouses filled with unwanted products. And these imbalances weren't temporary, weren't due to incompetence or sabotage. They were inherent to central planning, were the inevitable result of trying to run a complex economy without market prices. The official statistics were systematically falsified at every level. Factory managers reported meeting production quotas even when they didn't, because failing to meet quotas meant punishment, while reporting success meant rewards, and the reported production was measured by crude metrics that could be gamed. If quotas were set by weight, factories would make products heavier, producing thick glass or heavy machinery that was functionally inferior but met the weight quota. if quotas were set by units. Factories would make smaller units to produce more of them. If quotas were set by value, factories would use expensive materials unnecessarily to inflate the reported value. And this gaming of metrics was universal, was rational response to perverse incentives, and the falsified factory reports were aggregated up through the bureaucracy, with each level adding its own falsifications. And by the time the statistics reached Moscow, they bore little relation to reality, but challenging them was difficult because the entire system depended on these statistics. The legitimacy of the state, the careers of officials, the ideological claims about socialism's superiority, all rested on the statistics showing success. So there was no mechanism for correcting the falsifications. Instead, they were amplified, and Western intelligence agencies, trying to assess Soviet economic capacity, relied partly on these official statistics. And while they knew the statistics were inflated, they underestimated how much. They thought Soviet GDP was perhaps 60% of American GDP when it was probably closer to 40%. And they thought Soviet military spending was sustainable when it was actually bankrupting the economy. The consumer goods sector was the most obvious failure. Soviet stores were famous for shortages, for queues that lasted hours, for the disconnect between what was officially produced and what was actually available. The statistics showed massive production of consumer goods, refrigerators and televisions and washing machines, but the goods were often shoddy, broke quickly, and were in such short supply that obtaining them required connections or bribes or luck, and basic items like meat or fresh vegetables or decent shoes were chronically scarce. Rationing persisted informally throughout Soviet history. You bought what was available when it was available rather than what you wanted when you wanted it. And this created the queue culture. People would join a queue without knowing what was being sold, just assuming that anything worth queuing for was worth buying, and the black market emerged to fill the gaps, providing goods and services that the official economy couldn't. And this black market was massive, employed millions, probably accounted for a quarter or more of actual economic activity. And it was technically illegal, but was tolerated because everyone, including party officials, depended on it. You couldn't get a good apartment or a decent car or quality food through official channels. You needed connections or black market access. So the system was sustained by officially denying the reality that everyone lived. The official economy was a facade, and the black market was the reality. But maintaining the facade was essential to maintaining the ideology and the regime's legitimacy. The agricultural sector was catastrophic. Soviet agriculture consumed enormous resources, employed a quarter of the workforce, used huge amounts of equipment and chemicals, yet failed to feed the population. The Soviet Union had to import grain, millions of tons annually, from capitalist countries including the United States, and this was ideologically embarrassing. The Soviet Union with its vast fertile lands couldn't feed itself, while capitalist agriculture produced surpluses, and the reason was collectivization, the destruction of private farming and creation of collective and state farms. This eliminated the incentives that make agriculture work. Farmers had no ownership, no ability to sell their produce, no benefit from working harder or more efficiently. So they didn't. They did the minimum required and diverted what they could to private plots, small garden plots that families were allowed to keep. And these private plots, less than 3% of agricultural land, produced roughly a quarter of Soviet agricultural output, demonstrating clearly that private incentives outperformed collective organization even in an authoritarian state. But collectivization couldn't be reversed without admitting that the entire socialist project was wrong. So it persisted, producing chronic shortages and expensive imports that drained hard currency, and contributing to the economic weakness that would eventually destroy the system. The industrial sector appeared more successful. Soviet Union built enormous steel plants and tractor factories and hydroelectric dams, produced prodigious quantities of steel and cement and machinery, and these achievements were real. The industrialization of the 1930s transformed a largely agrarian society into an industrial power, but the production was often wasteful, producing goods that weren't useful, steel that was poor quality, machinery that broke down, and the emphasis was always on quantity over quality, on meeting numerical targets rather than satisfying actual needs, and Soviet factories were extraordinarily inefficient. used far more energy and raw materials per unit of output than Western factories, and produced enormous pollution as environmental concerns were subordinated to production targets. And the factories couldn't innovate because innovation wasn't rewarded. Meeting planned targets was rewarded, and innovation meant disrupting production, risking missing targets. So Soviet technology stagnated, fell further and further behind the West, and by the 1980s, Soviet factories were using technology that was a generation or more behind Western equivalents, producing goods that couldn't compete in quality or efficiency. And the only sectors where Soviet Union kept up were military and space, and these were prioritized, received the best resources and personnel, and operated somewhat outside the normal planning system, with more flexibility and better access to information about Western technology through espionage, so they could achieve successes like Sputnik and competitive weapon systems. But even military sectors suffered from broader economic problems, couldn't get enough quality components, suffered from the same informational and incentive problems as civilian economy, just less severely. The energy sector was the Soviet economy's saving grace and ultimately its doom. The Soviet Union had enormous oil and gas reserves, and as oil prices rose in the 1970s, oil and gas exports generated massive hard currency revenues, and this subsidized the rest of the economy, allowed importation of grain and consumer goods and technology, allowed the regime to buy off discontent with modest improvements in living standards, and allowed military spending to continue at unsustainable levels. But this created dependency. The economy became a petrostate, dependent on high energy prices, and when oil prices collapsed in the 1980s, falling from $30 per barrel to below $10, Soviet hard currency revenues collapsed. The ability to import grain and consumer goods disappeared, living standards declined sharply, and the economic crisis that had been masked by oil revenues became acute. And this coincided with Gorbachev's attempts at reform, perestroika and glasnost, which exposed the economic problems while failing to fix them. And the combination of economic crisis and political opening led to rapid regime collapse. The Eastern European satellites broke away in 1989, the Soviet republics declared independence in 1991, and the entire system disintegrated far faster than anyone had predicted, within 3 years of oil prices collapsing and reforms beginning. The Soviet Union ceased to exist, demonstrating that the economy had been far weaker than anyone understood, that oil revenues had been the only thing sustaining a system that was fundamentally dysfunctional. The black hole metaphor is appropriate because the Soviet economy consumed resources and produced little of value. Like a black hole consuming matter without emitting light, the Soviet Union consumed enormous amounts of labor and raw materials and capital, employed nearly every adult, extracted vast resources from its territory and from Eastern Europe, and produced relatively little that improved human welfare. The consumer goods were shoddy, the housing was cramped and poorly built, the services were minimal, and despite full employment and universal education and healthcare, Soviet living standards were far below Western levels, roughly a quarter of American levels by most estimates, and falling further behind over time. And this wasn't because Soviet people were less capable or less hardworking, but because the system wasted their efforts, directed their labor toward useless production or toward corruption and gaming the system. The talented people were constrained by bureaucracy and political controls, couldn't innovate or create, had to follow plans that were often nonsensical, and much productive effort went into coping with the system's dysfunctions, into getting around regulations, into finding scarce goods, into maintaining the facade while operating in the informal economy. So the economy was simultaneously very active, with everyone nominally employed, and very unproductive, generating little value per hour worked. And this productivity gap was the fundamental economic problem. Soviet workers produced perhaps a quarter of what American workers produced per hour, and this gap was widening over time as Western economies advanced technologically while Soviet economy stagnated. The comparison to China is instructive. China under Mao had similar central planning and similar problems. The Great Leap Forward was catastrophic, killed tens of millions through famine, and the Cultural Revolution destroyed much of what had been built. But after Mao, Deng Xiaoping reformed, introduced market mechanisms, allowed private enterprise, opened to foreign trade and investment, and Chinese economy grew spectacularly, lifted hundreds of millions from poverty, became the world's second largest economy, demonstrating that the problem wasn't inherent to communist countries or Asian cultures, but was specific to central planning, and that market reforms could work even in authoritarian states with communist parties in control. And Gorbachev visited China, saw the success of Chinese reforms, tried to implement similar reforms in the Soviet Union. But the political and cultural context was different. Chinese Communist Party maintained control while reforming the economy, but Soviet system was more rigid, more ideologically committed to central planning. And when Gorbachev tried to reform, the system couldn't bend, it broke. The political opening enabled nationalist movements and anti-communist organizing, and the economic reforms disrupted production without creating functioning markets, leading to worst of both worlds, shortages and chaos. And within a few years the entire system collapsed. So the different outcomes in China and the Soviet Union show both that reform was possible and that it required specific conditions, required maintaining political control while liberalizing economically. And the Soviet leadership either couldn't or wouldn't do this, chose glasnost alongside perestroika, political opening alongside economic reform, and the combination proved fatal. The looting of Eastern Europe was essential to sustaining the Soviet economy. The Soviet Union extracted resources from its satellites through unfair trade arrangements, required them to sell goods below market prices and buy Soviet goods above market prices. And this tribute sustained Soviet living standards and military spending. And when Eastern Europe broke away in 1989, Soviet Union lost this revenue source, adding to the economic crisis, and the Eastern European countries, freed from Soviet exploitation, began rapid transitions to market economies, joined the EU, and within 2 decades had living standards far exceeding what they'd had under Soviet control, demonstrating clearly that Soviet economic system was inferior, that the poverty in Eastern Europe had been caused by Soviet domination, not by lack of resources or capabilities. And this demonstration effect was devastating to remaining communist legitimacy, showed that capitalism delivered prosperity and that Soviet-style socialism delivered poverty, and contributed to the collapse of communist ideology worldwide. The intellectual death of central planning as a viable economic model, though some still cling to it. The empirical evidence is overwhelming that market economies outperform centrally planned ones, that private property and price signals and competition produce better outcomes than state ownership and central planning and monopolies, and the Soviet collapse was the final proof. The secret economic black hole reveals that authoritarian regimes can sustain themselves for long periods despite economic dysfunction by controlling information, by maintaining ideological commitment among elites, by suppressing dissent, and by exploiting whatever revenue sources are available, natural resources or tribute from satellites or loans from abroad. But these sustaining factors are finite. Eventually, the information manipulation becomes untenable. The ideology loses credibility. The suppression generates too much resistance. The revenue sources dry up, and the system collapses. And the collapse can be rapid and unexpected because the dysfunction was hidden, was known to insiders, but not acknowledged publicly. And when it finally becomes undeniable, when the gap between propaganda and reality can no longer be maintained, everything unravels quickly. The legitimacy evaporates. The economic arrangements prove unsustainable, and what seemed like a stable, if troubled system, reveals itself as a house of cards that collapses almost overnight. And this pattern isn't unique to the Soviet Union. Similar dynamics have played out in other authoritarian regimes, in Cuba, in Venezuela, and North Korea today. Systems that combine economic dysfunction with political repression and ideological rigidity. Systems that can persist for decades, but that are fundamentally unsustainable, that are consuming their accumulated capital and resources and legitimacy without generating renewal. And that will eventually collapse when the sustaining factors run out or when a crisis exposes the gap between official claims and actual reality, making the Soviet collapse not a unique event, but an example of a general pattern. The inevitable fate of centrally planned economies that try to operate without markets, without prices, without the information processing that makes modern economies work. Systems that create black holes where resources go in but little value comes out, where statistics show success but reality is failure. and where the gap between the two eventually becomes unsustainable and the entire structure collapses, revealing that the emperor had no clothes, that the superpower was impoverished, that the economic model that was supposed to overtake capitalism was actually starving its people while pretending to feed them, producing goods nobody wanted while failing to produce what everyone needed, sustaining itself through oil revenues and looting and statistical manipulation while claiming to represent the future of humanity, a future that when it arrived turned out to be empty shelves and broken promises and a system that collapsed into chaos, leaving a legacy of environmental destruction and economic stagnation and political cynicism that affects Russia and the former Soviet states today. The enduring consequence of the secret economic black hole that consumed the Soviet Union from within while presenting a facade of power and progress to the world, a lesson about the costs of abandoning markets and the impossibility of centrally planning complex economies and the dangers of systems that prioritize ideology over reality and propaganda over truth. Lessons that we're still learning and still forgetting, and that will probably have to be relearned through painful experience by future generations who think that central planning might work if only it's done differently, if only the right people are in charge, if only the technology is advanced enough, not understanding that the problem is fundamental, is about information and incentives and the limits of human knowledge and organization, problems that can't be solved by goodwill or technology or different personnel. Only by accepting that markets, for all their flaws, process information and coordinate activity better than any alternative we've devised, and that the Soviet experiment's failure demonstrates this conclusively, that the secret economic black hole that destroyed the Soviet Union was an inevitable consequence of abandoning markets, and that any future attempts at comprehensive central planning will face the same calculation problem, the same information deficits, the same perverse incentives, and the same inevitable failure, making the Soviet collapse not a historical curiosity, but a warning about paths that humanity should not take again. About economic systems that promise abundance but deliver scarcity, that claim to represent the future but actually represent a dead end, that sustain themselves through coercion and deception but eventually collapse when reality can no longer be denied.